the first question that we'd like to ask you is that, it's about the lockdown. And we know that you have a strong opinion against this kind of, complete lockdown, because India, actually, in India, we experienced, perhaps the most severe lockdown in March. And we know the kind of suffering. In fact, my subject is economics and development economics, and I know that my colleagues and we are so perturbed about the consequences of that lockdown on the workers and particularly the migrant workers and all. So our question would be that, but right now, I mean, maybe we are a little bit wiser now, and we know that, what might be the effects of lockdown, or how effective the lockdown might be. So given the trajectory of infection so far, and given the country's experiences with lockdown, so what do you think that, where do we stand now in terms of lockdown and other measures? I mean, the measures that various governments are trying.
Well, I think that was a very nice way that you put it, the effects of lockdown and the effectivity of lockdown. And it seemed to me right at the outset, I know that I woke up in late March last year thinking, haunted actually by images of people, what would they do under lockdown in India? And that has been borne out, naturally, because there was nothing we could do to prevent that. So what are the effects of lockdown? They are really profound, and the world is blinded to them at the moment. So what we have done, myself and some other like-minded people, is to set up an initiative called Collateral Global to document these effects. Because at the end of the day, this can perhaps be dealt with rationally, and we can perhaps think of what to weigh up costs and benefits sounds like a very simple equation, but that is true. That is all we need to do. The costs of lockdown are enormous. And we live in a world, and the reason I live in this country is because I feel I live in a world, not because the reason I've been comfortable living in this country is because I feel I live in a world that includes this country and other countries. We live in a world which faces a lot of death and distress from infectious disease. And we cannot respond to it individualistically, not at the level of a country, not at the level of a household. At no level can we do that without compromising our consciences. এটা কখনোই হতে পারে না যে আমরা ভেবে নেব যে আমরা তো ভালোই আছি, আমি তো ভালোই আছি, দেখতেই পাচ্ছেন যেখানে আমি আছি, আমি খুব ভালোই আছি, সুন্দর বাড়িতে আছি, আমার মেয়েরা ফিরে এসেছিল গত বছর, যেটা সাধারণত হতে পারতো না। আমি আমার চাকরির কোনো আশা করছি, কোনো সংকেত নেই, কিন্তু আমি তো ভালোই আছি। কিন্তু এটা কখনোই হতে পারে না যে এইভাবে আমরা ডিসিশন নেব কিভাবে আমরা এই পুরো প্যান্ডেমিকটার সঙ্গে আমাদের our engagement with this pandemic cannot be determined on those terms.
In the context of that declaration, you suggested, or your group suggested, something called focused protection or focused intervention. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that focused? What do you mean by this focused? Because not all of us, we know about this particular focus that you're talking about.
Well, it's a very difficult thing, actually, because, I mean, it's very easy, I think, to implement in the country that I'm sitting in. And it's not so easy to implement in other settings. And just yesterday or the day before, I got a very lovely message from a very close friend of mine and a wonderful man, Rustam Bharucha, who is a resident in Kolkata. Uni bollen je onar he became positive. He wasn't very ill. He lives in a flat with his mother, 94-year-old mother. And so he removed himself to a Parsi dharmasala. And, you know, even that is a privilege. আমরা সবাই জানি যে আমরা যেভাবে বাস করি তাতে সাধারণত কাউকে মানে আইসোলেট করা খুবই ডিফিকাল্ট। কিন্তু আমাদের দেখতে হবে যে তার মানে সেটা যদি আমরা না করি তাহলে তার কি ফল হবে সেটা তো আমাদের সবাইকে দেখতে হবে। বিশেষ করে I mean, we have to look after the young people. সেটা আমরা সবাই মেনে নিয়েছি। আমাদের কালচার তার উপরে, that's our foundation. যে আমরা অল্প বয়সীদের এবং বিশেষ করে বাচ্চাদের ওদের আমরা প্রায়োরিটাইজ করি সব সময়। সেটা তো আমাদের সব সময় মনে রাখতে হবে। তাই আমাদের যদি এক ধরনের সংকেত আসে যেরকম এই করোনা ভাইরাস এসেছে, তাতে আমাদের মেনে নিতে হবে যে আমাদের বয়সী কারো উপর তার প্রতিক্রিয়া মানে হয়তো ভয়ঙ্কর হতে পারে। I have just lost someone, a cousin of mine, who was a very dear cousin. But her father, Sunetra Gupta, who was a blind barrister, who worked for the rights of people who were disenfranchised, I know that their family would not have condoned lockdown because they knew that this would affect people in a way that it would be selfish to condone it. So we have to accept we belong in a community. I enjoyed in my time in Kolkata, a Marxist government which did wonders for a lot of people. We need to remember those ideas and those principles.
So can we extend this? Can you extend this argument a little bit? Saying that because some people are questioning even the rationale of wearing masks and keeping social distance, because given the dynamics of infection, again this question comes up: how effective are they? What is your discipline saying in this case? That do we have enough evidence that these measures would be very effective?
Absolutely not. They're not effective. It's very clear now from the evidence that mask wearing is a ridiculous farce, which is adopted by the West to signal that they were trying to a form of virtue signaling, which just indicated to others that they were participating in something which essentially effectively protected the affluent classes and the affluent countries. Mask wearing does very little to, we know this now from evidence. There were, particularly in the United States, there were, I'm sure Joe Bhattacharya has told you about this, but there are counties that did this and others that didn't. It's in any case, anyone with any brain could see that wearing a mask couldn't possibly be the way to out of this. So mask wearing is nonsensical. And the problem with mask wearing is it gives you a false sense of security, and which shouldn't be there. So, essentially, I would recommend, and my mother lives in Kolkata. I have said to her, don't go out. She fortunately has her sister to share her self-isolation with. But, you know, it's possible for some of us. And for those situations where it's possible, do that. But go, you know, I would not say go to the bank wearing a mask. It's just not a good idea. So no to masks. I think that's finished.
So if that is what you think, then how do you explain the second wave in India? Because the common perception is that we have been reckless, in terms of our behavior. We stopped wearing masks and we stopped maintaining social distance. So that's why we got into the second phase, which has become, I mean, people are terrified by that, the consequences of the second.
Well, the question to ask is why did it go down?
Mm-hmm.
Why is the second wave now receding? And if you think that has there been a real change in wearing of masks and social distancing, maybe. But as we know, it's an impossible thing to ask of a population of our size and density. So the truth is, which is being avoided by people, that herd immunity is what brings this down, the cases down, or the infections down. This is the truth, or this is the most obvious explanation. The other sad truth is that in acquiring herd immunity, people die, including someone I loved very much. So it's not something I say with a, in a flippant way. It's a huge cost to pay. But and if we could prevent that, as vaccines do help us do, I wish that had been the case for my cousin, but that didn't happen. So, life is tricky. We all know that. We live in, times we live in India, we live in a country where people die of all kinds of diseases and of malnutrition every day. And we have to accept it, but we have to make decisions that mitigate, that make things as good as make the suffering as small as we can possibly make it be. So I think the issue really here is that masks don't work. Lockdowns are, I used to give talks where I would end with a slide saying lockdowns are not an option. I now give talks where I say I start by saying lockdowns are not an option. Are we willing to take on our heads the deaths of so many people? Today from Collateral Global, we posted an article saying that child labor has gone up. Are we willing to take those things on? I know we've lived with them. We've always had to live with them. But are we willing to make things worse on this basis? It's a very difficult decision, morally and ethically. But there is this, in the West anyway, or in countries that have that level of affluence, there is this possibility of focused protection, even in the absence of vaccine. And that's what we were militating for. Now, what we need to do is protect those who are vulnerable with the vaccine. And we need to make sure that instead of vaccinating a 33-year-old in this country, that we're vaccinating the people in the rest of the world who actually need it.
So how the declaration has been received by the wider scientific community? What is your take on that? The Great Barrington.
Well, they didn't like it because of course, it challenged the mainstream idea, which is that we have to control infections in order to control death and disease. Now, that's an academic argument. Do you need to control infection itself, or can you just protect those who are vulnerable? But weighed up against the costs of what it does for those who are not vulnerable, who have their lives ahead to live, and of all the other people suffering of other diseases who are massively disadvantaged by our focus on this one disease, it's at least a question that everyone should try and answer for themselves before deciding on a particular course.
Since, you just mentioned about this vaccination thing, and I'm sure that you have a lot more to say on vaccination as well. So before we get into vaccination question, we have with us Dr. Gautam Das, and Dr. Das has certain specific questions on your some of your papers and what you said in your some of the scientific papers. And Dr. Das will ask you one or two questions on that. And so I'll request Dr. Das to shoot the questions now. Dr. Das, yes.
Namaskar, Professor Gupta.
Namaskar.
In a research article co-authored by you, Fundamental Principles of Epidemic Spread highlight the immediate need for large-scale serological surveys to assess the stage of the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic. In that article, you have said that the spread of a novel pathogenic infectious agent is typically characterized by three distinct phases, typically leading to the termination of first epidemic wave. You have also said that, according to epidemiological theory, the epidemic of SARS-CoV-2 will conform to this pattern. My question is, how can we explain the occurrence of second wave, third wave, and so many number of subsequent waves as predicted and propagated by the media?
Well, that's a very wonderful question. And I think the answer to that is that we also have, on top of that fundamental dynamic, seasonality. So the actual ability of the virus to spread clearly fluctuates in a way that is very significant with the seasons. So what I'm working on at the moment, and hopefully will put out soon, is a paper that shows that you can explain almost every pattern in every country on the basis of an interaction between the accumulation of immunity and the current level of where the herd immunity threshold is, depending on the season that you're experiencing. So I think that at the time that we wrote it, myself and also others who had projected somewhat more grim outcomes for the pandemic, we were all sort of relying on a very uniform spread through all communities, and we I think we were a little bit misguided on that, in that we didn't take into account that by March, in this country anyway, that the conditions for spread had already declined, so which brought down the infections. So the question is, what brings, we're all mystified, aren't we? We look at these graphs and we see infections going up, and they suddenly come down. What brings them down? So it's got to be either that something is wrong for the virus seasonally, or there's a lot of immunity built up, which is a classic kind of model, or the mitigations. And obviously it's actually, as we experience it, a combination of the three. Also regionality. So I remember in an interview I gave 4 months ago, someone asked me, do you think India's at herd immunity? I said, that'd be a ridiculous thing to even think about, because, maybe we have up to 75% exposure in Dharavi, but that doesn't mean that Malabar Hills is immune. You know, there's a lot of regional heterogeneity. So I think we need to take all of these things into consideration. And it's not easy. It doesn't make it very easy to make predictions, but models are there to help us understand what's going on, as everything else that we've done, you know, in our whole history. Whole history of India is about trying to understand what's going on and make some sense of it and do the best for everybody.
Madam,
So, yeah.
Madam,
So, yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
In that article, you have also said our simulations are in agreement with other studies that the current epidemic wave in the UK and Italy, in the absence of interventions, should have an approximate duration of 2 to 3 months. My question is, do you think lockdown and massive vaccination drive are two major human interventions? If yes, how do they impact the length and intensity of this epidemic?
Well, that's right. I mean, if left to spread, I think we would have had a pretty big epidemic. But, you know, if we sort of said shielded those who are vulnerable, it probably would have got through in that time. And we probably had a smaller second wave, but it would have come back because that's the nature of coronavirus infections. But, you know, there are lots of things to think about. One issue is if we'd had a big epidemic in last year, a lot of people who were not vulnerable then might have got the infection, might have become immune. Instead, we allowed them to become vulnerable because people die and people, you know, there's a natural rate of people becoming vulnerable and then dying. So it's it's not an easy situation to manage. But I think, yes, if we'd let it rip, as it were, or let it go through, then maybe we would have had a lot of immune people. We wouldn't be in the situation we're facing now. But having said that, of course, there are costs to that unless you're very well able to protect your vulnerable population. And we know at the end of the day, the reason why we all suffered is because our healthcare systems are not up to scratch. And if the United Kingdom, anyway, had spent even a fraction of the money spent in trying to stop the virus from coming in, to invest in the healthcare systems in the UK and globally, that would have made a real difference.
Madam, your model was based on data derived from Italy and UK. Do you think your observations equally apply to other set of populations like that of India?
Yes, I do, because the model is not derived from those assumptions. It's just saying how the basic dynamics may help us formulate some hypotheses and gain some insight into what's happening in other countries.
Madam, my last question. The Guardian published an interview with you on 5th June 2020. They said the best case set out by Gupta is not currently borne out by scientific data. Would you like to comment on it?
The best case is obviously not, it's not, first of all, that's not true. And secondly, the best case is always the outlier. But I don't think that's true. I think the best case was actually, there's no reason to believe that that was not true. But even if it had not been so, even if it's true that the infection fatality rate was higher than that in this country, that does not mean it wasn't the same, that those principles do not extend, or those analyses do not extend to other countries. We know that despite the horror that you've all experienced in India, the fraction of the population that have died from COVID is still very, very low. It's just that we didn't have, what did we not have? We didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. What does this COVID pandemic tell us? It tells us that we don't have the healthcare practice facilities in place to deal with a situation like this, that people will die not because of the virus evolving, people will die because we didn't put the healthcare facilities in place to make them survive.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very clear position that you have taken. I think, I fully agree with you that that it's a healthcare system that failed rather than, we couldn't contain the spread of the virus, because the spread of the virus, as you are saying, it could be anyway. I mean, it could be there anyway. So it is the preparedness of the health system that actually matters. Okay, thank you, Dr. Das. Do you have any other question?
No, thank you.
No. Okay. So now we move on to the question of vaccine. I mean, there are a lot of vaccine skeptics here in India as well. And as you know, that the skepticism actually comes from, in one case, it's some kind of perception about the vaccine, not necessarily based on scientific data and all. The other kind of skeptics, basically, they are science-minded people, and they say that you see that where is the evidence? I mean, just think about absolute risk reduction rates. I mean, they're pretty low in case of vaccines. So, I mean, what is the point? So, I think this is the kind of questions that a lot of vaccine skeptics they're asking. It's not that they're against evidence, but they're actually looking for evidence that, do we have clear evidence to show that this vaccine will be effective? So what is your take on that?
So I think we have very good reasons to believe that vaccines will be effective against preventing severe disease and infection, which immediately says, well, I'm not, raises the question, as it did to me, I'm not at risk of severe disease and infection, or even if I am a little bit, it's not relevant. Why should I get the vaccine? I did go and get it because they said if you vaccinate everyone over 50 will open up. So I saw it as a sort of service, a social service. I don't think I need the vaccine. I felt embarrassed getting it when so many people who needed it weren't getting it, as in people who are actually at risk. I think the whole attitude of the West is disgraceful on this point. What we need to do is vaccinate the vulnerable here in this country and in the world. That would actually prevent deaths. Is the vaccine 100% safe? No, it's clear it's not. But to those who are at risk of dying of COVID, that's fine. Even to myself, I've taken it because I'll take that risk. I would have taken the risk, as I said a million times over, to go and teach my students. Because why shouldn't I take the risk? When I think of the risks that my parents took, that my grandparents took, to make sure that their future generations lived a life of dignity and meaning, how ridiculous is it that I would not take the very small risk of getting COVID to avoid my students from having had the most demoralizing year in which many young people like them sought to self-harm and commit suicide? I mean, what kind of world is that? What kind of worldview is that? So, yes, there is a risk to the vaccine. It is a risk, as well as the risk of getting disease, that those of us who are older and should be focused on the well-being of the young should take. It is absolutely unbelievable that we should be rushing to vaccinate the young. Anyone under the age of 50 shouldn't even think about needing the vaccine, unless, of course, they're immunocompromised, and unless, if they want to, no, I'm not, that's fine. But to demand that of a population is ridiculous. What we should be doing with this wonderful thing that we've developed, which has its risks, which are relevant when you're young, but not relevant when you're vulnerable and old, is we should be trying to vaccinate the elderly and the others with comorbidities. So that's my position on vaccines.
Yeah, that's why you said that, most of the people don't need vaccine, right?
No, of course we don't need vaccines.
Yeah, we don't need vaccine. Yeah.
But also,
yeah, sure.
If we get what are vaccines going to do for us? They will transiently block infection, maybe, but that's not sustainable. We can't keep getting vaccinated every year to stop infections. We need natural immunity to do that, as it has done for the other coronaviruses.
Yeah, the other related point is that, about the transparency in clinical trials. I mean, so do you think that, it's less than what we would expect from a vaccine trial, that it's not, it's not completely transparent, and there are some ethical issues as well?
No, I think the vaccine trials have been done to a high standard, I suspect.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything to mistrust there, but in a slightly kind of twisting that around, I think what we should have done is licensed a vaccine in the vulnerable under lower stringent conditions.
Okay.
So by September we knew we had a vaccine. It wasn't difficult. It's just a very, very simple virus. So maybe what we could have done is lowered the stringency of administering that to the vulnerable people at an earlier stage before these subsequent waves hit. And just said, until we really, really test it properly, we're not going to give it to anyone under 18, or certainly even under 40. I find the whole thing ridiculous. There's no sense, no assessment of cost benefit. If I were now 84 and some vaccine was produced which may or may not be 100% safe, I'd say, yeah, I'll take it. But that's different. But to give that same vaccine to a 12-year-old, it makes my, every fiber in my body just quiver. I can't believe it. For what?
Thank you. The other question is related to vaccine, and we have with us Professor Alok Kaur. He has done some exercise on this vaccine and the spread of infection, I think he has sent you some of the slides where...
I'm very sorry, I haven't had time to look at them yet.
Okay. So Professor Alok Kaur is with us now, and maybe I would request Professor Kaur to just tell Professor Gupta about your question. Yeah. What is your question?
I'm really very sorry, I haven't had time to look at it yet.
Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I had a few questions regarding vaccine.
Alok, I can't hear you. শুনতে পাচ্ছি না।
আরেকটু জোরে মাইক্রোফোনটা কাছে নিয়ে।
হ্যাঁ।
ওকে, ইয়া। মাইক্রোফোনটা কাছে নিয়ে।
হ্যাঁ। শোনা যাচ্ছে এবারে?
হ্যাঁ, মাইকটা কাছে নিলে শোনা যাচ্ছে।
ওকে। So the slides I sent you, that was a
এখনো শুনতে পাচ্ছি না, unfortunately.
হ্যালো, ঠিক আছে এখন?
হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ এখন
এখন ঠিক আছে।
ঠিক আছে।
Please.
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ, যে স্লাইড গুলো পাঠানো হয়েছিল সেটা আরো প্রায় 1 মাস আগে তৈরি। তারপরে
হ্যাঁ, অত্যন্ত লজ্জিত যে আমি
না না, ঠিক আছে, আই ক্যান summarize what is there. It, I don't begin with the assumption that the vaccines work, which most of the models do, which I have come across.
Yes.
Why don't we, for the time being, forget about that premise and look at the numbers? It is empiricism, I know, but often the numbers do speak of events that we could not have thought about earlier. So, about effectivity of the vaccine, I have a question. Going a step further, I question whether the so-called second wave in India and many of the what is it, not the West, non-West countries that I have seen, particularly South Asia, whether the second wave is induced by the vaccination program, if not entirely driven by it. The numbers suggest that way. Yeah. Okay, I'll put the question, case of Israel, for example, which is showcased as the how effective the vaccination has been. But forget about the assumptions or premise that yes, vaccination has brought down the infection, has played a role in that infection. If we just ignore that assumption, we look at the patterns in the so-called, always said there are 3 waves in Israel. The first one was the ripple, not a wave. So anyway, the second and third wave. The second and third waves are very similar. One is a magnification of the other. So how do you, and in the third phase, there was vaccination. In the second phase, there were none. Then how do we say that vaccination has had a role in controlling infections?
I think that's a really important.
Okay, and this is one question about whether really it is working. And in Israel and in India, South Asia, the 2 different sets of vaccines that are being used. And in South Asia, I find that the second wave has invariably followed the vaccination program, beginning of the vaccination program. It was, in India, it was 16th January, and the second wave took off somewhere towards the end of February. And as there was a scarcity of vaccination during late April, middle April, and last half of the April, we have seen a declining trend in the vaccine, in the infection curve. And, you know, I mean, as I said earlier, that I've tried an informal model. I haven't done very rigorously, more by observation, and trying to explore, in fact. And what I thought was that the vaccination, since again the vaccination, there were more vaccinations being done, the infections may rise. The signs are there already, and that already declining curve has flattened and may soon raise its head once again to create a third wave? All these are, very speculative. But these are the questions. I question the vaccination's effectivity and, going a step further, whether it is causing the infection. I'll stop here.
So that's a really very important question, because it highlights what does the vaccine actually do. And what I think the vaccine does is it gives you protection against severe disease and death. Think about natural immunity. What does natural immunity to coronaviruses do? The first infection, it appears with almost any coronavirus, gives you a substantial amount of protection against severe disease and death. We know from the limited studies that exist that the infection blocking aspect of this is transient. So the way natural immunity or herd immunity is maintained against coronaviruses is through repeated infection. The good news being that repeated infection does not carry with it a high risk of death or disease. So how do we, I think you're asking exactly the right questions, and I think that's what we should be doing, is to be thinking, separating infection and disease. Disease can be prevented by a single exposure, natural exposure. Disease may be prevented by a single vaccine dose. Infection is not. So for me, in my little head, the way to put this together is to say, let people who are not susceptible to death just get naturally infected and continue that cycle, which then reduces the level of infection to a tolerable point whereby the risk of infection of vulnerables is low anyway. And then on top of that, we have the vaccines. So we protect them, we protect the vulnerables in that way. But until people recognize that there are different modalities here of both natural infection and infection, vaccine-induced infection, working at different rates towards blocking, natural infection vaccination, working at different rates towards preventing infection, which goes away quickly, as you said, and preventing disease, which doesn't go away quickly. I think once we have that in our heads, we'll be in a much better position to understand what's going on and to make rational decisions about what to do without harming a whole load of other people.
Thank you. So we are thank you, Professor Kaur. So we are almost towards the end of our discussion, and so finally, I'll ask you a kind of general question about this epidemiological modeling itself. For instance, for a layman, for common people, sometimes we see that epidemiologists come on the TV, and then the TV anchor person asks some questions, and then epidemiologist says something. But we guess there are some models behind that, right? So how do you tell us this? The importance of models and how important it is to convey the message of the model, for the people at large. I mean. So do you have some point to make on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point that I have to make on that is that we understand everything through some form of model. We're confronted with a whole load of experiences, and we understand them through some form of framework that we construct.
And predictions based on that?
Well, that's the thing. So we do that generally with life. And in our day-to-day lives, we accept certain models. So we accept the fact that the table is a table, even though actually many of us know it isn't a table. Apparently, you could characterize it as a hollow space with atoms floating around. We know, of all people on this planet, we know that illusion we know the value of illusion and the seductive qualities of illusion. We also know that we live life through Maya. So we as a people who have this extraordinary training in philosophy should understand that models are a route to understanding what's happening, to generating ideas that we then test and try. They're not a substitute for knowledge. And I think the single most sort of position on which the West has fallen down is in substituting hypothesis generation for knowledge.
Oh,
and that is not something any of our scholars from the 4th century BC would have looked upon with any good grace.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point that you have made, that model is no substitute for knowledge. So knowledge is something much deeper, and wisdom. And, so model is model, and because people are often perturbed by the fact that most of these predictions go wrong. So in many cases the predictions go wrong. So they start questioning the model itself.
Yeah,
so,
but I mean, if you think about how, I mean, the dialectic of, think about the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, think about the language of that. Right. Think about the sophistication of the questioning, the constant questioning that occurs between, the various powers. The powers are, it's difficult to find the different levels, the degrees of power. But think about the dialogue that occurred. That is the sophistication of dialogue that should have accompanied this epidemic. Nobody says, even as we know in our philosophy and others, there is no certainty. No one knows what is going on. We need to have humility. We need to have compassion. And those are the principles that are going to guide us through this, not some sense of, I've made a mathematical model and I know it's right. We will be guided through this by those old principles of complete intellectual humility and complete recognition of our mortality and total recognition of life as we live it being much more than surviving. Yeah, so this is the last question. The question is, which is something related to what you have just said. Sometimes we tend to believe that, all these counterpoints or the kind of dominant view here, which you are countering actually, it's all politics, right? So we say that, it's all politics. So what do you think about it? I mean, the opponents, your opponents, the positions that the dominant view, the position that comes as dominant view, it's all politics. So it is all politics. Yeah, it is all politics. So you agree? It is politics, and that's why I've. So it's not lack of considerably because of that. I'm not saying I'm right in my position, but we've been those, myself and others, who hold this view that particularly, on my part, my main consideration here is the harm that we do to people who are on the brink of starvation. It's not, to my mind, it is not all right to just try and protect ourselves without any consideration for what happens to someone, a migrant worker. It's just not acceptable. As I said, I was brought up in my father, Sunetra Gupta. He was, I and my mother, we just, it would never have, it did not situate anywhere in the Marxist internationalist ideology of Kolkata in which I was brought up and which I consider to be the ideal intellectual space for anyone to inhabit. Closing borders. What is this about? I mean, what is going on here? This is not how we elected to live. I have said I would, and people say to me, oh, what are you talking about? I would go out there and risk my life, which a very small risk it seems, to deliver tuition to my students. Why would I not do that? I've enjoyed this privileged position of being a professor at this university for a long time, paid for by taxpayers around the world, enjoying a beautiful life. Why would I not take on board that small risk to teach young people? These are the real considerations here. How can I sit up? I woke up in mid-March and I thought, what is happening? What is going to happen to the people for whom lockdown is the end of their ability to feed their children? These are the things we should be thinking about. I know we should be thinking about also the other things I think about, which I have been trained to think about, and I know do not underpin some of the decisions about herd immunity and this and variants. But the real thing is, how can we allow this to happen to the world? How could we allow so many people to go into starvation and go into, to die of other diseases in order to save other people we could save perhaps by other means and perhaps not?
So it would be naive to think that, the science would settle the thing and that whatever it is, more evidence, more evidence.
Day, remember, when, Tagore, when Rabindranath Tagore was coming back after the death of his son, and he said, Jorke pelam sathi, jete jete ekla pothe, nibeche mor bati. That's where we come from. That is humanity. That is what being human is about. It's not just about protecting ourselves.
Thank you very much, Professor Gupta. And, it was really wonderful.
Excuse me, Achin.
Bolun.
May I ask the last question after the last one?
Oh, sure. Bolun, so with that.
What do you think about vaccine passport?
It's an abomination.
আজকে ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গল গভর্নমেন্টের একটা সার্কুলার বেরিয়েছে যে ভ্যাকসিন না নিলে পার্কে মর্নিং ওয়াক করতে দেওয়া হবে না।
ভাবা যেতে পারে, কখনো ভাবা যায় যে এরকম একটা অবস্থা?
ভাবা যায় না,
না ভাবা যায় না,
কিন্তু অথরিটি এটা ভাবতে পারছে। মানে আমরা এখানে চলে এসেছি তো,
কি করে এখানে চলে এলাম ভাবা যায় না।
Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you. And if Stobita, any other issue or question?
Gautam, কিছু বলবি, Dr. Das?
Dr. Das,
Madam, my last question.
Acha.
To make our understanding better, I just ask you one simple question, maybe repetitions. To reach herd immunity, can we reach it independent of vaccine? Can we think of it without vaccine?
I think the vaccines do, their job is to protect those that we find hard to protect on our journey towards herd immunity. So, generally in this country, we could say, okay, stay at home to those who are elderly. Obviously in our country, we don't want to do that. But we have the vaccines now, so we don't need to scratch our heads and think about how that can happen. So herd immunity can only be achieved by natural infection or maintained by natural infection. Let's focus the vaccines on those who are vulnerable. We should take the global stock of vaccines and give them to those who are vulnerable in the world. And the rest the work will be done by natural immunity, as it has been for other coronaviruses.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gupta. So we end with this, and thank you so much. We are so grateful to you for.
I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you, and
thank you. I mean,
please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any further questions. I may be slow in answering.
Sure.
But please do that.
আমরা আবার ডাকবো আপনাকে
যে কোনো সময়।
ধন্যবাদ।
ধন্যবাদ।